an alarm. Some of the recent statements that have been made from the United States in particular, but actually sometimes from our own government. So I'm going to just go straight into this webinar. The format will be that each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, maybe just slightly longer, leaving half of the time almost, we hope, for discussion questions. But we would like you to put your questions in the chat because there's quite a lot of us here. It's not going to be possible to see all of the screens. The easiest thing would be to post in the chat, and feel free to do that as people are speaking. You don't need to hang on to your question. Just type in the chat as soon as you're formulating something that you would like to ask or raise. And we do hope that there will be a dialogue. We expect there's a range of views in the room, so to speak, and we're expecting quite a lively discussion. I think we will start with Isabel, then we'll go to Barrie and then to Almut, unless you would like a different order, in which case I'm happy to hear that now from our speakers. If you're happy with that, Isabel, would you like to start?
Yes, indeed. There are 3 points that I would like to focus on. The first is looking at the past couple of decades and over, because like so many conflicts, they don't come out of the air, they come out of history, and we should note. The second thing I want to focus on is what I see as the complete inadequacy, not strong enough word, I think almost negligence among the leaders of most of the NATO countries in trying to find peaceful solutions rather than just saying, here's more weapons, more weapons. And finally, I want to consider what should be done next after, if there is a ceasefire of sorts. But starting with the first point, I can remember the enthusiastic mood in many ways, despite all the problems in the 90s, terrible conditions for many in the former Soviet Union, certainly on the Russian side. But I can remember the enthusiasm. We're going to be building new security structures in Europe. We had the Organization for Security, Peace and Security in Europe. We had all kinds of different initiatives. And it looked fairly positive for change, but that didn't happen. And I'd like to quote here the former NATO General Secretary, George Robertson, who was also a former British Defence Secretary, whom I knew for years. And George was always a very, very loyal Atlanticist. But he said in an interview, this was in July 22, a radio interview, and he was commenting on the fact that he felt there was progress being made. There was an initiative for a Russian NATO Council that had been set up, and he thought there was progress, but he went on to say the policy of building closer relationships with Russia was opposed by the United States. It was not pursued. Now, you could understand why. There were some in the US establishment who didn't want the idea of this much stronger European bloc, shall we say, cooperating, and where the old status quo was more attractive. But he said that put the bloc on a lot of what might have been cooperative action. He also went on to say that he thought NATO was mistaken in stating its support for Ukraine and Georgia's membership in principle of NATO, which was in 2008 that they did this. And we just have to remember, some of us might think it irrational, but how do you think the US would feel if Canada, Mexico, Panama might suddenly feel that perhaps it would be useful to have Chinese or Russian missile bases on their border. Of course, I was old enough to be active during the Cuban crisis, but this is what did happen. So we had all that failure to take positive opportunities that happened in the 20 years or so beforehand. So that's a context. Now, when we come to the period after the war, there were two particular opportunities where we might have had a chance of peace, perhaps a bit messy, but nevertheless a peace. And one was March, April. This is well documented now, has been analysed quite intensively, but March, April, where we had direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And Turkey played an important role here, hosted in April an Istanbul conference. And they did get to the stage where they did have agreements on paper, lots of discussions. And then that came to nothing. Now, there may have been various reasons for that, but one that the leader of the Ukrainian delegation later said was because they had these various European leaders and Americans, but particularly Boris Johnson, the awful Boris Johnson, went to Kyiv and said, oh, you mustn't give in, brave fighters, you know, we'll back you to the hilt. And that was one of the elements in Kyiv's decision to withdraw from that. But then we had, at the end of 2022, we had Mark Milley, who was chair of the US Chief of Staffs, was asked by Biden to prepare a report on the Ukraine situation. And he came back and he said, look, Ukraine has been more successful than we thought in holding the line. But he said, as far as he was concerned, they were at peak success in doing that. And that he saw things going downhill all the way after that, and just a perpetuation of destruction and killings and coming out in a worse position. He prepared that report that was submitted to the president, and Biden slapped him down. So that was another opportunity that was neglected. And since then, we've had really nothing over those years from the leaders in the European NATO countries. We haven't had real efforts at negotiation. We've just said, we'll give you more weapons, we'll give you more weapons. Keep on going, you brave people. And the result of this has been just more and more deaths, more and more destruction. And at the end of the day, not the prospect of any better settlement than might have been achieved if some of these early initiatives had been taken. Now, the final point I want to make is, if there is a ceasefire, which we hope, but if there is a ceasefire, then what should we be doing then? And the thing which has been so appalling just in the past few weeks is that all we're hearing from the NATO European states is, we must spend more on defence. We'll have to increase our defence, more weapons. That's all we've been hearing. Whereas the one thing they should have been saying is that if there is a ceasefire, we will create a major reconstruction fund for Ukraine, so that we can start putting those resources, that money, into rebuilding and trying to create out of the mess a successful society. And the interesting thing about that is that that would be a challenge to Russia, because on the assumption that Russia may come out with more territory, or at least certainly some of what was Ukrainian territory, but if there's a successful reconstruction, rebuilding, if there's success in Ukraine, then Russia's going to be under pressure on its bits. What's it going to do? Is it going to fail people there? And I say this as a reminder that the former Soviet Union didn't collapse because there were military rebellions. It collapsed because there were more and more of its public who felt that they weren't achieving the quality of life that could be achieved, that they thought existed elsewhere in other parts of Europe. It was that lack of faith, that lack of conviction that eventually eroded the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries under its military umbrella or pressure. So let's remember that history has a lot of lessons, and that even though the agreement that comes out is a bit messier, if it's an agreement that stops the killing, if it's an agreement that enables you to start building a better society, then that can be a very, very important pointer for the future.
Thank you, Isabel. We'll just move straight on, and I'll ask Barrie Hebb now to introduce himself and speak.
Okay, so my name is Barrie Hebb. I'm an economist originally from Canada, but I've spent about 27 years, mostly in the region of the former Soviet republics, looking at conflict-affected and disaster-affected populations. And I'm just going to try and share my screen now. So I'm not the best technical person, so I hope it works okay. Let's see. Share. Is it visible? Okay.
Yes, for me, Barrie, I can see that.
Okay. There, okay, I've got it now. I'm improving over the years. But normally when I talk about my work, I work as a humanitarian economist. And when I tell people I work in the humanitarian field, they assume I'm a doctor or a medical person, and they don't understand why there would be an economist who goes into these areas. And basically the thing is I look at what the harm is that's inflicted on people due to the war or any other type of disaster to try and figure out ways to reduce and mitigate the harm that people are experiencing. And so basically what I want to say in the introduction of this is that often in the mass media, one of my disappointments is that if usually we focus on the cost of war being like the military budget, like $60 billion of the military budget, or we look at the human casualty rates, the number of people who are killed or injured. But this is really limited. It doesn't capture the deeper extent of the human suffering and deprivation that people actually experience. What I want to present is, and I'll try to keep it within the 10 to 15 minute range, some actual preliminary data just to give you some idea about the extent of suffering that people are enduring as a result of this ongoing war. And let me see, I'll go to the next slide. I was thinking over the weekend, where would I like to start with this? It's difficult to know what people would be interested in. So I thought I'd start with one of my favorite authors, dissident authors about the anti-nuclear movement, Andrei Sakharov. And he wrote a book called Alarm and Hope. And many years ago, I was sitting reading it, and he made this comment. He went to the political directors in the Soviet Union, and as a nuclear physicist, he explained to them what would actually happen if you detonated one of these bombs. And he explained, you know, the initial impact, the devastation, destruction this would cause, how many people would kill, and then how much time it would take for the recovery to happen. And one of his insights that he said about this, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not capturing him in his own words, but he said when he looked at the audience, he realized that the political decision makers looked with happiness that they actually had a weapon they could wage against other people. And he said, actually, he realized these people should never be led anywhere near this tool of destruction. And that's when he became a very severe dissident of the nuclear war and nuclear bombs. And so I just put a quick figure on the right-hand side that even though people think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Cold War, as far as we know, most of these incidents are classified. There were at least 37 known episodes or close calls. 25 were alleged crises, and 12 were technical incidents where there might have almost been a detonation. And there are all kinds of other stats about broken arrows and things like this, but you can imagine what that impact would be on people if you just think about Fukushima or Chernobyl or something. And so what I would like to do is just go on and talk about some of the economic impact of war so that people understand exactly, or a bit better at least, a bit better what the consequences and suffering and deprivation that it causes are. So typically in the media, we see statistics like this, that, in the war since 2022 to the end of 2024 in Ukraine, there have been just over 12,600 people killed. 669 of them were children, and injured, which is usually left out of the statistics in the newspaper. Injured are almost 30,000, of which almost 1,900 are children. Now, these are preliminary statistics. I'm sure that there's many more than that, and there's just a lot of registrations that aren't there. And I want to point out as well at this point that I'm not excluding intentionally the casualties of the soldiers, which are probably huge, but those numbers are not officially available in any reliable way. So I'm not excluding them in a moral sense. I'm just, I would not want to do that. I just can't put those numbers in if I don't have them. The estimates are not reliable for me to do that. But we also have previous casualties in Ukraine from the conflict from 2014 to 2021, which is estimated another 14,400, of which 3,400 were civilians. And then we have from the World Bank and its partners, a rapid damage and needs assessment from the end of 2023 that put over $500 billion of damages on Ukraine's economy from like damaged buildings, infrastructure, people lose their farms and, their land gets mined and they can't use it anymore. They've tallied that up to be, 500 billion. But even if I just use these numbers, it still doesn't really get to the human suffering that is actually a result of this. So I usually start off by trying to paint a quick picture of Ukraine as best I can with some unfortunately depressing data. But just before the war and during the previous conflict period from 2014 to 2020, this graph shows the number of people who were living at or below the subsistence line in Ukraine and the percentage of the population. So if you look at 2015, there was just over half the population was living below subsistence in Ukraine. And subsistence was just over $100 a month. So it's like $125 a month. This shows that, there were already extensive numbers of people in Ukraine living in poverty, and that's been true for a long time. But the subsistence statistic doesn't really capture everything we need to know. It looks like it's improved just before the war started, but the problem with the statistic is that it looks at who is at or below the subsistence line at like $120 a month. If you're just a couple dollars above, you're considered no longer like in poverty. And so it doesn't really capture that. So we have to combine that with modern assessments that have been carried out during the war. And the last multi-sector needs assessment that I've seen that was really good showed that about 75% of the population is at or below subsistence. And so they really don't have the resources at their disposal to cover their basic needs. And about half of them were even below half of subsistence. And this is quite common in Ukraine. About the monthly pension is about $50 a month. And many people have salaries about $100 to $120 a month. And it's quite a deceptive economy because if you go to the city centers, you'll see lots of boutique shops, nice cafes and restaurants, but this is really representing only a small percentage of the population. And most people don't have the resilience to withstand a shock like a war, and they'll endure extreme suffering. And if you compare it to like other economies, most people live paycheck to paycheck. So you have to imagine that suddenly you lose your job due to the war, you can't cover food and groceries, you lose your shelter, you lose your rent. It's devastating. Well, this is the estimate that's from the humanitarian response plans. You can see that there's a number of people in need of conflict assistance. So what this means is the following. There are people who suffer from chronic poverty in Ukraine, but these are the numbers of people who are in need of assistance and emergency life-saving assistance due to being conflict affected, like their house is damaged or they have to move and they're displaced. These numbers ranged from about 3 to 5 million from 2015 to 2021, and it dramatically increased to 2023 to 17.6 million. So there were 17.6 million people that were estimated to be in severe need of life-saving emergency relief. So that's like, basic food, clothing, shelter, blankets, food kits, water, sanitation, things like that. So it's not a pretty picture. So it's probably over half the people that are remaining in Ukraine today are in need of humanitarian assistance. I hope I'm still clear. I'm not going too fast. It's okay, because I tend to go crazy with all these data charts and slides, so I apologize. And I'll go back and answer questions at the end. So this slide is trying to show that a couple other things. One of the other harms that's caused by the conflict is that people flee their homes because they're escaping, violence and damage or the threat of being hit by rockets or debris or being injured. Within Ukraine, today there are just over 3.5 million internally displaced people. So they've left their homes. Another 4.3 million have left but have come back to Ukraine. There are just about almost 7 million people who have fled the country and they're living abroad, and they're registered as refugees abroad. And of them, there's about almost 6.4 million registered in Europe. This still doesn't capture everything, and it's not a complete picture, but I'll try to maybe give a few details from other analyses that I could share. So if you look at this map, this is from Al Jazeera. They update this map quite regularly, impressively so. They show the border crossings out of Ukraine into neighboring countries. And it's not necessarily all the people fleeing permanently. There are many people come back and forth across the border all the time, even for regular business or travel. But of them, there's a whole bunch of people that travel because they're fleeing into neighboring countries, and they might return home. And a couple of things that the mass media doesn't really do a good job about showing with this is that many of these people who flee Ukraine don't have any money because they don't have good jobs in there. They were already living in poverty. So they leave to the border. And unfortunately, they can become easily targets of criminal gangs because they're highly vulnerable and they're at sort of severe risk. There's huge numbers of increases in human trafficking, prostitution, people getting stuck in hosting environments, people living in crowded collective centers or living rough on the streets. But of course, you can always see a small percentage of people who are successful, they reintegrate, they get new jobs and move on. But the vast majority of people are not experiencing this because they don't have the language, the skills, the knowledge, and the income to relocate and stay and integrate comfortably and stay somewhere else. And they're enduring severe economic hardship and often resorting to severe negative coping strategies as a result. So it's something that's just not captured. It's okay, they're not injured or killed in the war, but they are enduring extreme suffering and deprivation. I'll skip this for now, but I collected the data also on where they're registering in Europe.
You're on 11 minutes now, Barry.
How many minutes?
11. You've had 11.
Okay, I'll speed it up. So one of the other problems I want to mention was that not all the countries, despite the best of intentions of many people to help Ukrainians, a lot of the countries are not equal with the amount of protection they can offer, the amount of assistance, the speed of the assistance, or their capacity to actually host people. Am I still on? Or?
Yes, yes, you're still with us. Don't worry.
Okay.
Lost yourself.
Oh,
See yourself.
I'll just 1 second. I don't know why it's
About it. Just keep going, I think.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your slides.
You can see the slide, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, perfect. So this graph unfortunately shows, I hope I get an extra minute and 30 seconds for the delay. Okay. Anyway,
Yes.
despite this large number of, currently there's about, between 15 and 17 million people in Ukraine in need of humanitarian assistance and rapid relief. But the budget, it might sound quite impressive at like $3.11 billion. When you work that out per person, I want to capture and show people like how much money we really are giving people who are suffering already and were suffering before the war, how much we're actually able to provide for relief to those people who are in need. You can see that there's two statistics here. There's the amount of that budget that is actually divided by the number of people who are in need. And in 2015, it was $63.20 per person per year. And that's all costings in with all the overheads and everything, which is almost nothing. I mean, what could you buy for that per year? But they actually narrow the budget down to only target the people with the most severe needs. And so that for that year was $98.80 for the actual people targeted. So about 30% of that budget goes to just the costings. And so really people are getting, you know, about $10 a month or something like that. It's increased dramatically. I just can't see my screen perfectly. It's increased dramatically, but you can see in 2025, the amount available per person in need in Ukraine is $207, but they actually just target a smaller number of people. So they actually only have about $440 per person. And so the actual budget looks like this. It's quite sad. The total budget of 3.11, it works out to 14.6 million people in need, or about $213 per person per year. So that's $17.75 a month. But if you look at the target, it's 365 per year, or about $30 per month per person. So there's very little humanitarian assistance being provided to provide people with genuine relief to mitigate the pain and suffering and deprivation that they're actually experiencing. One of the harms that unfortunately happens because of the war is that Ukraine is unfortunately, well, has to borrow a huge amount of money to cover its expenses. And so you can see here, this graph shows the total national public debt. It doesn't cover the private debt, which is also increased. This is just the public debt that's a burden on people. And it's projected to increase to over $230 billion by 2029. And you can see that before the war, it was just under 100 billion. But this is also another burden because people are poor and they're enduring pain and suffering, but they also have to carry this debt burden moving forward, which is another economic harm of the war. So I put it on a per economically active person because it's people who are in Ukraine who have to pay that money back from their salaries through their taxes. It's estimated, these are my preliminary estimates, they're not publishable yet, but I estimate that it would be about just over $17,000 per working person in Ukraine by 2029. And that's about, 10 years of ordinary people's salaries. And so this economic deprivation and suffering will go on for quite a long time, just because of that public debt, not to mention the private debts people are also taking on. I'll skip this just for the sake of time.
Just one more minute, okay?
Okay, I'll summarize. So these are the final statistics. So this, I want to also capture why this is so severe. Ukraine's economy has actually suffered multiple crises, not just the war. And this is, you have to understand this context is why they won't be able to recover very well the longer this war goes on. This graph shows real GDP adjusted for inflation since 1987. And the first problem is that Ukraine has been suffering from the transition since 1991 and has never recovered. Has lost trillions of dollars from not being able to recover from the collapse of the USSR. Then it was hit by the financial crisis, then a conflict in 2014, plus COVID, then the war. This has had a devastating effect on people's ability to actually finance and recover. And there's not really a lot of hope in sight. This is on a per capita basis. You can see that the economy's never recovered on a per person basis since the collapse. I put Ukraine's GDP per capita and the forecast of 2028 here in relation to European countries just to show that it's extremely low. This is Ukraine compared to fragile and conflict-affected countries, but then also Europe and the European area, just to put it in a little bit of perspective. I skipped that for now. I was asked about catch-up rates. How long would it take Ukraine to recover? And so here, this is just before the war. This asks how many years would it take for Ukraine's GDP per capita in 2021 to catch up to these other economies at a growth rate of 3%. In this case, it would take 45 years to catch up to Hungary, 44 to catch up to Poland, 42 to catch up to Croatia. And my point here is that even before the war, there was really a long period of being behind, but this war has actually added even more onto that. So we're talking about being behind by another generation and a half. Yeah. And I don't have the estimates to show you for that part yet, but these also just show growth rates, and that's where I want to leave it off. So I hope I've managed to fit it into 15 minutes. But what I would like to maybe conclude with is that the economic suffering and deprivation that people are really enduring, I hope that this evidence has sort of given you at least some trend ideas, but that the longer this goes on, the long-term implications for people staying in Ukraine and people suffering abroad is going to continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so we're now just moving straight on to Almut. Almut, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Almut Rochowanksi. I am an activist. I'm also now, because of this war and in the course of this war, I have sort of moved back to what I originally did, which is international relations analysis, because I came to understand that I couldn't practically and safely do grassroots activism, including with like women's groups in Ukraine, if the state of the world is such as it is. There's just no space for it. And I also wanted to thank Barrie for all this data, because I think all of you here should understand the things if you've just seen, this is like copyright Barrie Hebb. Nobody else has seen this yet, this kind of analysis. You're being treated to a really unique and very useful, if very sad reality here. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of where do we stand with war and peace right now? And it connects to what both Barrie and Isabel have talked about. And I want to start by reminding some of you here were maybe with us about a year ago. Last year, we were talking about the second anniversary, and I remember saying, I just really hope we won't have to meet for the third anniversary, but here we are, and Ukraine is still at war. We are still at war for all intents and purposes. And back then, a year ago, there was a consensus in expert communities, not a consensus, but sort of a daring idea that, okay, maybe 2024 will be a bad year for Ukraine, but in 2025, they will have recovered and they will do another offensive, counteroffensive, and this time they will be successful. And I thought back then that this is completely absurd, you know, in military terms. And I think, but now we can see like how intellectually and also morally bankrupt this approach was. But it fits in because for the last 3 years, I think all of us, Ukrainians, but also Europeans and Americans, we've been subjected to gaslighting. We've been told that diplomacy is not a thing. It never works. All or most wars end in one side's victory. We've been told that diplomacy is just the same as appeasing war criminals. And we've been told that Russia, especially Russia more than any other country, can never be trusted and breaks all its international agreements. Now, all of this, of course, is nonsense. And I have to say, the fact that this discourse was so, what they call hegemonic, like it was so dominant, right? Like you could barely find an alternative to this. In part, I blame it on the failure of the peace movement, such as it is, and to which, you know, where I include myself, that we have not been able to put a consistent, believable, and loud enough alternative to this story out there. An alternative that I believe would have been backed up by the facts much more strongly than what we have been told. We have also seen, I mean, Isabel spoke about the failure of European politicians to espouse peace and democracy, and that is true. The only politicians in Europe that speak about, that have consistently talked about diplomacy and peace have given us idiotic reasons like we want cheap Russian oil again, right? Like we've never had a substantive conversation. Let's also remember, for example, last year's summer, Viktor Orban, PM of Hungary, went to Moscow and to Beijing, supposedly to start peace talks. Everybody in Europe threw a hissy fit, but it was a complete flash in the pan. Nothing came of it. He didn't pursue it any further. It was just for the shock effect. And so this is not serious peacemaking. We've been, to what little peacemaking there has been, it has also been gaslighting. And now we are at this very odd moment, sort of a black swan event in international relations of a massive international realignment. Along comes Trump. And he has sent his people to the Munich Security Conference and elsewhere to propose a peace deal. And he has already started talking to Putin, and like, you know, their subordinates have been starting talking to each other. But I also want to say this is bad peacemaking. It is certainly not good enough peacemaking. And many have said this, it is not good peacemaking because Ukraine isn't at the table. And that is true, that is bad. Although there is this reality that the US and Russia have a somewhat separate, if overlapping, contestation, a conflict with each other, and they need to work those things out between each other, and no third state has really anything to say here. Like, it's not even just about Ukraine, and we've also seen that from the readouts from the meetings, for example, in Saudi Arabia, that only really a tiny bit there was about Ukraine. The rest was about other sort of baggage, unresolved issues between Russia and Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine is not at the table, it is unlikely to come to a good peace, because any settlement that is worked out between Russia and the US, there's always a risk that Ukraine will say no and keep fighting. That could be for a number of reasons, just political pressures on its leadership. It could also be because, a government under these pressures collapses and sort of things crumble apart into a more partisan type of war or conflict. But then also the Trump way of peacemaking, just like over the top, over the heads of everybody, is bad, because we know that if you want a good peace, you have to include the people who have been most affected by war. You have to include communities, you have to include civil society, because peace must deliver for people. If it doesn't deliver for people, if the friction and the violence persists, then there's a very good chance the conflict will just erupt again. So like this peace is not going to be stable. And the other thing is if peace doesn't deliver for people, then they won't have the conditions in which they can actually rebuild their country and their community. And because they will, things will not be functional, things will not be safe, there will be no proper reparations, no justice, no rebuilding, no human security. And therefore, like what's happening right now, to me, I don't see how this ends in a good peace. And we know how to build a good peace because we've been thinking about this for decades. And I mean, humans have been thinking about peace, obviously, for as long as there's been humanity. But for the last decades, we've made a very concerted effort to study peacemaking and to get better at it, just to develop sort of like the state-of-the-art peacemaking. And we can now say, oh, like, bad Trump, he has thrown out all these lessons. But in reality, as we've already mentioned, like, this has been going on for 3 years. All of our governments and all of the governments we've recently voted out of office in Europe have have not paid attention to this. They all threw out these lessons. Because if we dismiss peace processes in general, like on the whole, then there's also no room for talking about peace like as a state-of-the-art thing. Like, how do you do peace well? There's another reason why the Trump approach may not work. A few days ago, I heard from Thomas Graham, who's one of the leading American diplomat experts on relations with Russia, spent a long time working for the State Department on Russia, in Russia. And he has been conducting track 2 diplomacies, like as a private, now retired individual. He has been traveling to Russia and meeting with interlocutors. And they are telling him, and this sounds very likely, that the Russians are actually worried that the Trump team, although it is now sort of open to talking, has nobody on the team that is actually a Russia expert. By that, they don't mean somebody who's read all of Dostoevsky. They mean somebody who knows like the Cold War and post-Cold War history of Russian and US engagement and failure of engagement. And so they feel that, like whoever they're talking to doesn't really understand where they're coming from. So there are a lot of like layers in this why things could not pan out well. So I want to like also, the biggest story, of course, is that because of the sudden turn that the Trump administration has taken, with like Secretary of State even saying, we are no longer in a unipolar world. We're now in a state of multipolarity. Like these are words that you couldn't say even just months ago in Washington, D.C. It was entirely taboo. And I think you couldn't say them in London or in Brussels either. People would sort of freak out and panic. But Rubio has now acknowledged this reality, a reality that just months before he was appointed, he also didn't acknowledge. But, politicians. And so now Europe is in a very odd place. It is very difficult for Europe to fully acknowledge this new reality. It is manifested mostly in panic among European leaders. One of their first sort of like knee-jerk response has been, well, then we will just support Ukraine on our own and Ukraine has to keep fighting. And they say things like, Ukraine isn't losing, you can keep fighting like this for maybe half a year, maybe until the end of the year. And you know what? That is probably correct. Like Ukraine can somehow keep fighting for a while. But the question is, then what? Half a year by the end of the year, if he keeps fighting, where are things going to be? Very likely, in all likelihood, Ukraine will be worse off. And Ukraine has just come of like Barrie's graphs have shown very well. Ukraine has come out of a decade of missed chances. Ukraine has come out of a decade of missed chances to prevent war, or to end war again and again and again. And Isabel, you talked about this. It failed to make use of the Minsk process. It failed to seize the chances in Istanbul, and we largely bear blame for that. And so right now we can call this moment the Munich moment, because, you know, these presentations were made at the Munich Security Conference by Trump and his team. And I just have to wonder, like, in a year's time, do we meet again? And I have to say, well, now Ukraine has not just missed Minsk and Istanbul, it has also missed Munich. Like, we have to wonder, like, what is it? What can we do now? Seize this moment, turn it into something better, so that the graph for Ukraine from here on goes up again, right? So that there's a chance for this country to recover and get better and heal. And I think the key has to be, like, I watched our European decision makers and politicians these last few days, and it is not a pretty picture. Like, one day they will say, oh, we're going to put troops on the ground. And you just know that they're not serious, because they know that Russia has already said it will not accept NATO troops on the ground. But they also know that they're not going to put troops in there if the US isn't going to back them up in terms of offering, like, you know, its nuclear umbrella and its protection in Article 5, right? So
11 minutes,
then,
Alma.
yeah, I'm almost done. So we know that they're not actually going to go in without this protection. And Trump has already said he's not going to offer this protection. Actually, Hegseth said it. So they keep throwing out these things again and again and again. Then they pull them back, then they throw them out again. And it's basically, when we look at them, we have to understand this is a symptom of their being quite lost. Or today, the news was that Danish PM, so Denmark has been very hawkish in this war. Today, Danish PM Mette Frederiksen said, and I'm going to quote this, I understand that many people think that a peaceful solution or a ceasefire sounds like a good idea, but we run the risk that peace in Ukraine is actually more dangerous than the war that is going on now. And you just have to wonder, more dangerous than what, right? Like, how can this war, and also more dangerous to whom, right? Because as we know, in Ukraine, there are plenty of people to whom this war is lethally dangerous every day, every minute. And so I'm going to finish by where we stand in Europe now, because I think then we can bring it back to, as a peace movement, what should we do now? We've been hearing for years from foreign policy experts and, like, you know, national security experts that Europe must do more for its own defense. And it has always only meant that Europe must spend a lot more on weapons and on troops, and that it basically must bring up the level of military spending to where it replaces all the military input of the US in Europe today. And we've been told we must either do this in order to keep the Americans sweet so that they stay and protect us, or if the Americans leave, which they seem to be doing now, so that we can replace them. But this entire discussion is completely dysfunctional and sort of lacks elementary logic, because nobody's asking the first question. First principles, the first question must be, what do we even need to defend against? Who or what is threatening us, and why? Is there maybe a bit of a security dilemma going on here? And how could we diffuse that? Could we not possibly be safer and more secure if we pursue robust diplomacy, if we pursue the mutual arms control that got us into safety after the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, and similar diplomatic tools? And there are lots of experts and politicians that just assume that the threat will be Russia and that this threat will be equal to everybody in Europe. Before the weekend, one of the major Brussels think tanks, the Bruegel Institute, published a report which is called something like European Security After the US. And it basically says, like, literally, Russia has X pieces of this kind of military hardware and Y pieces of that military hardware, and therefore Russia will attack Europe. And this is just lacks elementary logic, right? And strategic thinking. Unfortunately, this kind of discourse is right now the tenor across European expert circles. This is true in the UK and just about anywhere else, with a few exceptions. And governments are quite literally telling their voters, we must sacrifice social spending and infrastructure in order to ramp up military spending. And so this is the question, as a peace movement, how do we deal with this? Like, what do we do about this? And I am not seeing much of a anything yet. I'm gonna have to end on that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so now it is time for the questions, and there's a bit of chat in the chat. Not that many questions, in fact, but Mary asked, what should the conditions be for an effective peace agreement? And I think that's probably a question that maybe each of the panel might have something to say about. I don't know whether, Isabel, do you want to start?
Well, like all these kind of situations, it's the best you can get. And the difficulty is, for example, I mean, it was suggested before the invasion started, when there were threats of the invasion, but they hadn't actually become a reality, that the key things that could be offered to stop it were, one, saying that Ukraine would remain non-aligned, and two, that there would be a legal acceptance of Crimea as Russian territory. Now, I don't know whether that would have prevented an invasion, but now I think we're in the situation, and one has to come back to a reminder to some of the rest of us, especially those living in island spaces, that when empires break up, there are a lot of very messy lines, as we know in the former Yugoslavia, as we know from the Ottoman Empire, and where you have people with different ethnic identities, and there are difficult border lines there, and it's not always the neat and tidy solutions. So what the best that Ukraine can get, I think it is crucial, quite crucial, that they say we will continue to be non-aligned, because that was one of the big Russian grievances that they thought they were promised with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and they were told then, just verbally, no, NATO won't move east. And instead they found, yes, that's exactly what they did. New missile bases in Romania, in Poland, and so on, circling. So that's a big grievance there, and I think that should be addressed. And I think the ideal thing, and Almut referred to the Minsk process, the ideal thing is, of course, people on borders. They are the ones who should be deciding where they want to go and should be consulted. But at least if there had been processes for Donbass area, and so which involved a much higher degree of local autonomy, that may also have diminished some of the violence and so on that occurred there. But ultimately, Ukraine's got to get as little, shall we say, concessions on territory, but I think almost certainly there will be concessions on territory have to be made. But the important thing that it's got to get out of others, and that means the NATO powers, US, what it's got to try and get out is support for reconstruction, which I think Barrie's work there was really educational, because many of us who we knew something about it certainly didn't realise a lot of the things that he outlined. And I trust that SCND will get all your material and that we'll republish it and produce it in some form or other.
Thank you, Isabel. Right. I think,
So,
sorry.
can I step in on this question?
Yes. Yeah, we've got a few questions backing up. So yes, just briefly on.
But I think the conditions are really important. And so, I mean, for any conflict resolution process, and I learned this actually from one of the women who was one of the negotiators in the Northern Ireland peace process. And this is what any expert on this topic will tell you. You go in and you have to know for yourself, what do I want? What can I not live without? And what am I willing to negotiate away? And you have to know that about the other side too. So these are the things to keep in mind, right? And then, of course, your relative, sort of all the bargaining chips you bring to the table determine what you're going to get. There's no, like, you can be lucky and maybe you have an ally who like puts some chips on your side of the table, right? So like Europeans can put on the side of the table of Ukraine the sanctions. They can say, look, Russia, if you do this one thing or these two things that we'd really like from you, we'll do some sanctions relief. So like we have bargaining chips and we can use them that Ukraine doesn't control, but we can like make them available to Ukraine. As for NATO, I mean, Ukraine has said many times before, okay, fine, we don't go into NATO. The problem has always been that NATO was never able to say no, this is not a thing anymore. So like basically at every step, it was either the French or the Germans or the US who said like, actually Ukraine can be in NATO. And then the others said, no, maybe not. And maybe later and maybe who knows, and deferred. And Ukraine may not be into NATO, but is always free to ask for being into NATO. You know, like the door is open, you can scratch on it was sort of like the solution. But now something very dramatic and very important has happened. Like Pete Hegseth in Munich revealed that the Trump administration is saying that Ukraine will not be in NATO, full stop. And the interesting thing is that we have people have told us that they've spoken to Jake Sullivan, like Biden's national security advisor, who privately said the same thing, privately as late as 2021, said, of course, Ukraine's not going to be NATO, but we are not going to say this openly. And now it has been stated openly. And the moment one NATO member, never mind the largest one, has said it, that question is now resolved. So in a way, this is out of the way now. As for territories, I think the consensus has been that the Russian government will never get Ukraine or anyone else to, or not for a long time, get anyone to acknowledge that it has actually acquired these territories. Like their legal possession of these territories will not be recognized. And we've heard from Indian and Chinese diplomats that basically like Russia is fine with that. Like Russia is okay to have like a Cyprus solution. You know, part of Cyprus is controlled by Turkey. Nobody recognizes that, but everybody's fine with that solution. So like it could look like something like this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Almut. There's a stream of questions and comments interleaved from somebody called David, and I wonder if you just want to pick up. I'm not suggesting you try to pick them all up, but if you could maybe they're all, I think, directed at you, so maybe you could just respond
I have to look at them now. Sorry, I'm paying attention to the
If you
talk.
have a
So
look at those.
Can I just respond to the first
Okay,
question first? Oh,
Barry, go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I just want to make a couple of quick points about this question about the conditions,
Sure.
etc. And I can only start off by telling you what I can't do. You know, one is that I'm not a diplomat and I don't have the authority to actually outline the specific conditions that would be acceptable to all parties. Second, I'm not a Ukraine citizen. So who am I to make decisions on their behalf without their consent? And I'm not delegated for that. But what I can suggest as at least an approach for motivating a discussion about peace is to outline just the depth and breadth and length of the deprivation and suffering that millions and millions and millions of Ukrainians are suffering from. And that I think it's really up to them, because if we're going to continue to militarize Ukraine in a war, we're asking them, we're actually forcing them to endure that pain and suffering and deprivation without their consent. And I think we have to ask them what they're willing to accept. And for the other countries to get into messes about to sign this for them without them, it's a very messy process. So I think the first thing I would say is that there's at least a step forward. We must understand just how awful this is and how many people are not willing to go get mobilized in Ukraine. They're being terrified. This is a terrible situation. And if we continue the war, it means more suffering, deprivation, more death, more destruction, more injuries, regardless of who is right and wrong. But at least if we can get a ceasefire, which would be at least stop the killing and destruction, we can then focus, as we do in other conflicts, reconciliation processes. But we'd have to ask a conflict expert about how to go and tailor that for this specific case. That's beyond my ability. I wish I had a number for that in a graph. I don't have a solution for that. I can just tell you that having endured part of that conflict myself and having been in the Donbass in 15 and 16, the deprivation and suffering and the rockets and the damage that I've seen, bombs through school buildings and hospitals damaged, this is not, it's not endurable. And I have friends who are soldiers and they just want it to stop. I can't speak on their behalf in a legal way. I can just say that the people are commenting that to me. And then the only thing I could say as a last point is that although I'm not a Ukrainian citizen, I am a Ukrainian income taxpayer. And I would want to deal. But the latest survey statistics we have from last year was that the vast majority of Ukrainians also wanted to have this ended and have a deal. Now, what that deal looks like, I mean, that's really, I think we have to engage with the local communities and sort that out. And it will take a long process, just like it did in Yugoslavia. It's still not over. This is not an easy solution, but just because it's not an easy solution doesn't mean we should just continue the war and let the pain and suffering continue. So those are the comments I wanted to just share.
Thank you, Barrie. And
I will get it in a NATO bit. Yeah,
I've seen those surveys too of the Ukraine people who are still resident in Ukraine wanting peace. So, but I think that also links into Duncan's comment from Stop the War Edinburgh. Going forward, the peace movement needs to campaign on the theme of welfare, not warfare. Massive militarization across Europe can only be at the expense of state spending on health, social services, education, social services, etc. And I think Bill Ramsey had also would want to make that point. But Almut, do you want to?
Yeah, so I see one question here from Nick Godson. I will also pick one of the statements by David. But the question that Nick wrote is, do you have a specific suggestion for how European leaders should proceed? I haven't heard one yet. So in line with what I said about negotiation processes, you basically, you force yourself to the table, you get your seat on the table by being willing to put bargaining chips. This is a multi-stakeholder process, so it's a mess. It's already complicated, right? And another complication is that right now, basically, the US, which is both the biggest stakeholder next to Ukraine in a way, has also become sort of a rogue stakeholder that we don't quite know what they want, or like they want things that, just a few weeks ago they didn't. So it's a bit hard to judge, but basically you put something on the table that makes everybody else want you to be there, right? So like you go to the Russians and say, sanctions relief, but for a seat at the table. And then the Russians will tell Trump, actually, we do want them here. You can think of similarly, you could say things vis-a-vis the US that you'd want there. So like there are certain things, like the Trump government, is incredibly transactional, which, there's a lot of been said about that. But like you can just look at what would be the sort of the buttons that you can push with them, the things that you can offer them in return for that seat at the table, so that you can then play your hand there. What they actually have to contribute, I mean, one way or another, Europeans, I don't want to say they're on the hook for reconstructing Ukraine. Certainly the Trump administration would like that. He would like to squeeze money out of Ukraine and just go home, which is not going to happen because there's really no money to squeeze out of there, in not in the ways that they expected. The Europeans will be on the hook for one big reason only, if only for that one reason, and that's the biggest, I think, is the fact that millions of Ukrainians now live in Europe, across the European Union and in the UK as well. I just read a statistic just this morning in Austria. The most recent statistic is that 60% of the 88,000, there are 88,000 Ukrainians there, and 60% plan to stay in Austria long term. And we've had, the numbers have gone up, but already last year, friends of mine did surveys, and it was like anywhere between 30 to 50% of people who had fled to Europe were planning to stay there. They were planning not to go back home. And this is going to be like, Ukraine cannot reconstruct without its people. And on average, the people who have left and who want to stay there are those with what's called migration skills. So these are people with resources and skills, and in sort of like in the prime working years. So you want them back. And so in a way, Europe will be the greatest contributor to reconstruction. And that will be something that both the US and Russia will want for them. And that is another thing, sort of pressure point that you can use and say, look, fine, we'll do it, but you have to give us the seat at the table. So there are ways and means to get in still. Still after 3 years of sort of refusing and being irrational about it, but it's not too late. Like, it's never too late.
Okay,
And then
thank
there was something from David. Let's see, there were a number of things that I want to comment on. What was it? So yeah, the question was, oh no, this is not David, this is someone else. Oh, sorry. Da, la, 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 la. There's so many of them. Go ahead, take another question and I'll pick one in the meantime.
Well, we're actually already just slightly over 8, and that was the time we said we would finish. We could run for about another 10 minutes, maybe, if people, I mean, obviously people can vote with their feet and leave at any time, but I suggest we just try to get through a little more because we haven't perhaps given the audience quite enough, although I do note that there's a lot of yes, so Bill Ramsey wants to make a point, but a lot of the comments are from David and Nick. You've already managed to reply to Nick. Bill, do you want to speak? Can you speak briefly, please? And then we'll try to let Almut, can you just try and pick some David responses, and I feel we should reply to at least some of the questions, issues.
Very briefly, I'm going to focus on one particular aspect, and it is narrow and it's trade union orientated within the United Kingdom and Scotland in particular. I had a comment piece in the National today titled, "Does fear of Russia really warrant an arms spend hike?" And it's aimed not about most of the discussion going around here, but out the talk about significant increases in arms expenditure. And what my concern there is what the impact that could have on expenditure in the public sector in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, and particularly in Scotland, as a Scottish trade unionist. And the assertion that's been put forward, it may be true, it may not, but it needs to be tested. As a trade unionist, this needs to be tested, and I don't intend to get into the details here. If the United States decides to pull out from Europe, and it won't actually be quite pulling out from Europe, its naval assets, its intelligence assets, and many its communications assets will still remain. The question is, absent land and air assets, does NATO, with Finland and Sweden joining, is the order of battle, as they might put it? Is it a credible size to defend against a supposed future Russian attack? That needs to be tested and empirically discussed and considered. At the moment, from what I can see, given the ratios of attack to defence and what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, which seems to prove the point, there is little prospect over the next 5, 10 or 15 years of the Russian Federation being in a position to overtake offensive operations against NATO. Strikes me that that's simply incredible, but it needs to be tested, and Scottish trade unionists, when they're asked to sacrifice Scottish public services, not in terms of support for Ukraine, but increasing the size of the order of battle for NATO, needs to be tested in some sort of public way. Thank you.
Okay. Almut, back to you.
Well, I'm gonna get into Bill's question, and then there was one from David about the frozen funds that I will respond. So I don't want NATO to test anything. Like, if you mean we want to like actually test it, you can do a lot of tabletop exercises, and people do them all the way. And most of the tabletop exercises that I have read about, there is this, it's like the dumbest thing. It's like, and I'm so like allergic to it, but there's this tiny little stretch of territory between Poland and the Baltic states, and it's called the Suwalki Gap. And basically, it's like where Russia has a bit of territory, and basically, almost everything goes sour the moment like Russian troops cross into there. So most of the tabletop exercises go poorly from that moment on. But I think far more importantly, and this is also what we learned from tabletop exercises, none of the tabletop exercises ever play through like a war, a big European territorial war, you know, with multiple locations, complex this, you know, naval that, air that, land forces, drones, whatever, because very quickly nuclear comes into the equation. Like, it is just not likely for these two sides to fight a very long, drawn out non-nuclear war, conventional war, because very soon nuclear comes into the equation, and then all bets are off because we're all dead. So this is one of the problems, like to, and I think like at the end of the Cold War, towards the end of the Cold War, we all knew that. That was public knowledge. It was widely debated in our media. You know, our public intellectuals spoke about it. Children in schools knew it, and our policymakers took that into account as they built a different future. And now we don't. But so I think Bill, I think you're right. Like right now, a lot of the talk about sort of like facing Russia militarily is kind of silly. It's like unserious. It's not based on these like actual military exercises that almost every time lead us down a nuclear path very, very quickly. So, and then, you know, like some very clever people will say, well, we can just ignore that because, you know, we know Putin and in the end he will chicken out. And like, to me, that is not good enough, right? Like, that's also very unserious. So, the question from David was about the frozen funds, the 300 billion Russian frozen funds. Because he said, like, basically, like, the EU said, like, if Russia, what was it again? Sorry, I'm gonna just have to find it again. There's just you're putting so many comments here that I get lost in everything. Yeah, have said that the 300 billion of Russian assets in its banks will not be returned to them until Russia pays for reconstruction. I've actually heard a few days ago coming out of the like the negotiation team that the Russian government is fine with this money being sort of agreed to be given away and go into Ukrainian reconstruction. I've also heard over the years again and again that the Russian government has basically written this off. Like they know it's gone. They didn't expect it to be returned. And so that in a way makes it easier for them to now use it as a bargaining chip on the table. Because like they didn't really fully expect to get it back either. The situation is complicated in that in Europe there's some very tough political fighting about what should be done with this money. And you also have to understand it's not like there is like a vault of gold in one place and there's all this money. This money is invested over a number of countries. The bulk of it is actually invested in Belgian securities, as far as I know. And so different laws apply to this money depending on where it is. And let's just say the countries that don't actually hold any of this money often make some very bold suggestions for what should be done with it, whereas the countries that hold it are much more conservative. So this is a more complicated question, I think. But it is a very good thing to keep in mind as one of those bargaining chips. Barrie, sorry, maybe you want to say something about reconstruction and funding for it?
I was going to make a quick comment that, you know, there's different definitions of recovery. One is to go back to where you were before. Another one is to completely recover all of your losses and be where you would be today if none of this damage and disaster had ever happened. And so if you look at the multiple crises that Ukraine has faced since 2014, for Ukraine to go back to an economy which it had in 2013, and looking at the IMF forecasts going forward, it would be a much larger economy today, and it would take about a $6 trillion investment done properly to get a return of that sort of level of GDP and GDP per capita in Ukraine today, where it should be had nothing happened and taken it off that trajectory from 2013. Then you have to include all that's extra money for the damage to people and veterans payouts and all the hospitalization, all that stuff would be on top of that. And it's just such a huge amount of money. Then add in that there's a crisis before that from transition, which is still ongoing, and several $1 trillion of losses that's separate from the conflict. The economic situation of Ukraine is in a very desperate situation. And I guess the other comment I want to tie into that is that, okay, there are comments I see that, well, maybe we can't trust the peace negotiations, we can't trust the peace deal. What happens if we're wrong and it does work? Well, then people have their suffering and deprivation and harm reduced. But, I think it's worth a shot because what we're actually arguing, if we don't argue for peace and get motivated for it and advocate for it, we're actually saying we'll just accept that people will continue on this path and without consent from the Ukrainians themselves who are actually enduring this. And there's one last point related to something Almut said about the displaced population in the European Union and elsewhere. This is also a severe human capital loss for Ukraine, and it affects their ability to attract and retain economic activity to come back. All those skills are gone, and those skill sets they take with them. And this is something that's often missing in the development literature. And I'm going to write something about this quite soon. It's a severe loss for Ukraine. But you can imagine that in America and Canada, they spend about $16,000 a year on public schooling and then a whole bunch more on university. If you lose those people after all that financial investment that took money away from other public services, et cetera, and they leave to another country, this is a massive public investment loss that affects long-term economic outcomes and providing opportunities for people to have a livelihood and provide a future for them and their children and dependents. So it's not a minor issue. And when we have millions of people who have already left Ukraine since 1991, millions who have left since the financial crisis, millions more who have left since 2014, and now a whole bunch more, it's already was in a demographic crisis, ranked in the top 5 in 2019 by the UN for the most significant decline in population demographics. It has an older population, and there's going to be a huge demographic burden of not having enough young, hardworking people who can actually cover the pensions and all these other expenses. And the burden of debt will be even higher on a shrinking and shrinking working population. It really looks depressing, but I want to make that point because there's very few options. I guess the final thing I'll say is that I often get in trouble as an economic person or an economic advisor because many times I sit in offices, I used to work in politics, people had all these dreams and schemes of what they want to do, but I have to tell them at the end that that's not a real option. You have to look at the options that exist and choose the best from the less than ideal options. And it's a bit of economic realism. Otherwise, the ideal picture will end up leaving people without the lives they deserve and without the consent and the agency. So anyway, those are my comments in return or reply. Oh yeah, I can add, I guess, can you still hear me okay? There's something with my screen. This comment from Bill Ramsey. Yeah, there's I think I can, rather than me say it, I can quote Juncker, who said it before. He said Ukraine before the war, Ukraine was looking at like at least 40 years. And I saw no potential for EU membership for Ukraine for generations. But that's also another point on this I can say for fact is that Ukraine was offered the association agreement in 2013 instead of candidacy status. It was a free trade agreement for the Eastern Partnership that was in lieu of EU membership. And so there hasn't really been an intention there, I don't think, from the EU side. There never has been. But I think the prospects for Ukraine to afford the investments that it would take to join, and if it gets rapid status or rapid joining, then we are in a problem where other countries who are still in the candidacy status might complain. There's a whole bunch of complications in that as well. But economically speaking, I don't see any, if it follows the same path as others, I don't see any path over the next generations for Ukraine's accession and enjoying the economic benefits of it.
Isabel, do you want a final comment?
Yes. The idea that we don't negotiate with nasty authoritarians who deny human rights, etc., is such a nonsense. Ask the Kurds what they think of Erdogan, and the many people also who are in prison there. So we do this because we have to, because you have to come to agreements as best as you can. And one plea I would make, and this isn't, most certainly isn't, because I don't recognise what a nasty authoritarian Putin is, but and the systems he has perpetuated in Russia up to a point. But I'd also like to say we very carelessly talk about Europe all the time. And it's a shorthand. We all kind of fall into it. But 40% of the land mass of Europe is Russia. And whether we like it or not, we're sharing a continent. And we have to, as best as we can, avoid wars on that continent. And the notion that if somehow or other we come to agreements where Russia gets some territorial advantage from this war, that it means it will be invading all over the place, is such a nonsense. It has taken them 3 years on a country that is right on its doorstep, where it had a significant part of the eastern area of that country, which were ethnic Russian and sympathetic. And it still hasn't made an easy gain. So the notion that it's going to be invading here is a myth of the military-industrial complex and of many of our politicians who are happy to posture and see these divisions perpetuated. So let's remember this, we share a continent, and the most important thing is, for the sake of the ordinary people of Ukraine, we should be trying to find a settlement, messy though that settlement may be, for a time being.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm going to ask us to stop there because we are 20 minutes over our time. I'm going to ask you all to thank the speakers. I mean, you can clap with your symbols. I think there is a possibility of a clap, although actually we can't really see. We can't necessarily see you all, but yeah, I can see numbers of clapping going up. Thank you so much. I thank very much everybody for being here. It goes without saying that as a campaign for nuclear disarmament, we have always resisted the idea that NATO should be a nuclear armed state, that nuclear weapons are any solution, that nuclear weapons put the entire world at risk of the end. And as an anti-nuclear campaign, that's one of the issues that we need to bring out, is the irrationality of some of the responses to this conflict, as if the whole world would be safer by us all being armed with nuclear weapons, which is an utterly insane response, really. So thank you very much for being part of this, and a particular thanks to Barrie and Almut. We hope that they'll maybe both be contributing to Nuclear Free Scotland, our magazine, and this video has been recorded and you will be able to play it back at some point in the future. So thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. It was wonderful to see you.
Thank you.